With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us again this morning on the AgNet News Hour. I'm here with Lorrie Boyer. Lorrie, I had something on my mind I wanted to talk about this morning, just starting out. And it was something that you had brought to mind a couple of days ago, but we were talking about Cal OSHA and autonomous vehicles on the farm. And first off, the whole idea of this, I just find so interesting because we're just, moving into the future, the idea of autonomous vehicles anyway. And then using them around the farm. And of course, especially here in California, that's going to come with a state agency that wants to regulate it.
Yeah, and I had done a search of this as well. And this is actually not a brand new topic. This has been talked about since, from what I could tell, about 2022. Just like I said, brief little inspection or brief little survey here on how long this has been issued. So it has been talked about for at least 2 years. And the question is, how shall Cal OSHA monitor, or should they have authority over this? Like, what does this look like for them? What are the ramifications of farms and operators using autonomous equipment on their farm and ranch? And what does that mean for safety? What does that mean for liability? That whole thing that goes along with this. Now, this, from what I can tell, has not actually been figured out. These discussions continue. There's comments that continue to come into Cal OSHA. This surrounds employees who actually work on these as well for repair, or maybe they're picking these up, different things like that. So it is really interesting. The whole conversation about autonomy, to me, is interesting, not only in terms of tractors and cars that drive themselves, but now there's testing on actual trucks and haulers that are going down to highways, these major highways, including Colorado, that have no driver. And so not only that, but the safety of people around. So maybe on an operation, workers aren't dealing directly with it, but they're doing their thing. And the next thing you know, here comes an autonomous tractor barreling at them. What does that mean? So there's a lot of questions. And I think a lot of questions on behalf of Cal OSHA on what their authority is over this.
I know. And I have so many questions as well, but it makes sense that the Cal OSHA, which stands for Occupational Safety and Health, and so it makes sense that they would be the government agency overseeing it, because there are safety concerns, I guess, or safety standards with machinery that need to be followed. You want to prevent exposing your employees to moving parts on your autonomous vehicle, or you want to make sure that it's being properly, that somebody is properly guarding the machinery as it heads down. You don't just turn it on and let it go take off. There is a human who guards it along, or guides it. I guess I want to say guides it along. You want to also make sure that if there are accidents, you have the correct ways to record that accident, and to make sure that protocols, first off, to set up protocols, but then to make sure that those are followed as well. And I can only imagine there's got to be some risk. I think that having these autonomous vehicles and machinery in a lot of ways are going to make farming even safer. But there will still be some risk involved, because there just is. Anytime you're talking about heavy machinery, there's going to be some type of safety risk. No matter what we do, no matter how careful we are, there is a risk. And so it makes sense to have some type of oversight, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I haven't done this interview, but I have it booked, in talking to an expert, a university expert, about societal concerns with using autonomy. Particularly, this interview will focus on agriculture, but people concerned about using autonomy in agriculture and what all that means. I don't have any details, obviously, because I haven't done the article, but there is a societal interest in what we're doing on farms in general. But now this comes into play. And as a matter of fact, I read an article here not too long ago about some of these larger companies, these larger tractors, that there's even concern in the Midwest right now on just having so many out there, and the dangers, the potential dangers that could happen of using these tractors out here in these big tractors in these big fields. What is the dangers of that? So there's some other concerns out there. Cal OSHA is not the only agency, not the only ones that are monitoring this. And also I think about, if I'm a Cal OSHA employee or manager, you got to have someone with the knowledge and the background to be able to even begin to write these protocols for this.
Right. Right. It's so interesting. You brought up other concerns as well. And just as a human who drives on highways, I don't like the idea of a truck driving itself, especially a heavy truck, driving itself filled with any product, agricultural or otherwise. I don't care. I mean, I think humans can also be problematic, but I feel safer with a human behind the wheel and not some type of, autonomous truck just heading down the road.
And in the end, who has access to all the autonomy software and things like that? We've talked about this a little bit before too. All the hacking and all the nefarious activity that is going on, it is
Hmm.
possible. And there is a movie. Maybe I watch too
Yeah,
much TV, but there's a
I
movie
was
out
just thinking the same thing.
on
What
how
was
a
that
car,
movie called?
yeah, gets hacked and hijacked. And I
Yeah.
think that is a real possibility as well. I mean, we hear about this all the time. Major safety, or they claim their safety organizations, entities, banks, financial institutions are getting hacked all the time.
Yeah. So, right. What's the safety for making sure that all of our autonomous trucks all over our highways don't get hacked? And there's probably an answer to that we don't know. But still, it's something that I think about when we have these types of discussions.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. I think it's a fair argument that that is a potential.
Yeah. Now, I do think that automating as much as you can, especially with a lot of our specialty crops, those have been difficult to automate because when we're talking about like tender fruits, like tomatoes, it's hard to automate like tomato picking, but it's being done. And I think that that has been extremely beneficial, especially when we look at how difficult it can be sometimes to get ag labor. We've mentioned it again, something else we've mentioned on the show before, but having years when I have seen fruit rotting in the fields because there simply were not workers to pick the fruit. Uh, so having automation like that, where we can have, machines that come in and take care of that to help fill in these holes in our labor, that's fantastic. I think that is a great idea. And all of that technology that we're getting that can do that now. To me, I'm fascinated by it, and I think it's the answer to a lot of problems. But yeah, there does need to be safety oversight on it. As difficult as it can be sometimes to work with the government, there does need to be some oversight.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. When we come back, we will continue this conversation and we're going to chat a little bit about a famous ghost, we'll say, in California. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Chatting here with co-host Lorrie Boyer. And, you brought up a topic. We were talking off mic before the show, and you mentioned the Ghost Lake. So let's talk about that a little bit.
We like talking about things that interest us. So I hope that things are interesting to other people as well, because I find this topic just as interesting. That over a decade ago, Tulare Lake was here, connected
Right.
communities. Back, there were Indian tribes that really relied on this. This was a huge lake, huge lake. And then over the course of the years, it has been dried up, some of it on purpose, some of it because of weather, some of it because of land acquisitions and turning it into farming. And a lot, from what I understand, a lot of the dried up portion of this lake was turned into pretty large farms in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And so it went away. It dried up. And now with all the weather events that we've been getting in California, and all these stream events and just kind of awkward weather patterns, it's starting to come back to life. So this ghost lake, as they call it, is starting to come back, and it's causing a lot of problems, especially for farmers in the area. And then as we talk about these issues, a lot of ramifications for that, not only the loss of farmland, but these are private property areas. What do you do when you own property that you're trying to use, and then all of a sudden it turns into a lake? What does that mean?
Right. Right. So in 2023, so last year during our flooding season, tens of thousands of acres of farmland were submerged, which disrupted planting and harvesting for the crops in the areas. That includes almonds, tomatoes, cottons, things like that. And the farmers there faced billions of dollars in losses due to their crops just being destroyed. Also, it damaged a lot of infrastructure in the area as well. There was problems with homes, roads, irrigation systems. A lot of things suffered a lot of severe damage because of that flood last year. And it's interesting, as you noted, it's interesting to see just through the course of time how this lake now is starting to reappear. Now, we haven't had that kind of significant flooding again yet this year, but who's to say that, because we are heading really into the stronger rainy season. So who's to say that we're not going to get more flooding and see problems like that arising again from this lake area. It's also, California and water problems are pretty much hand in hand at this point, but it just brings back into the forefront, I think, questions about our water management and, how can we do this better? We're not managing floodwater very effectively in a lot of cases. I mean, I don't know what we could have done with this ghost lake in the Tulare Basin anyway, but we need to be looking at that so that we don't continue to lose farmland from it.
Yeah, and as you mentioned with the rain, but also what's contributing to its fill is the excessive amount of snow in the state.
Yeah.
And that snow melt is really adding to the fill of this. And just to give you an idea of how big this is, it's more than 100 miles, or was, I should say, more than
Right.
100 miles.
Right. And that was 100 miles of ag land pretty much. That was, I mean, there was a lot of township area as well, but yeah, and it's just a significant problem. And like you were saying with the snow melt as well, again, we haven't had that kind of snow yet, but I mean, with the way that the climate is changing, we are starting to get some more extreme weather patterns. And I think that that means we could see this ghost lake coming back and making an appearance more frequently this year, next year, who knows? But I think that it's going to become something that's reoccurring.
Yeah, here's another little tidbit I just saw too. So the lake has been dry for 130 years. That is a
Yeah,
long time.
that is a long time. 130 years. And then so much was built on top of it and through it and around it. And then to have it come back and reclaim its space, that's an issue.
And what does this mean for insurance? I wonder
Right.
how that works.
Right. Right. I really don't know. I mean, do you even have flood insurance in that area? I don't know.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know the answer to that either, but and who would think after 130 years that you would need flood insurance? But if you are farming out in a former Lake Depression area, it would make
It
sense.
would make sense. We are going to take another break. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. She is Lorrie Boyer, and we will be right back. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. So, what kind of challenges could farmers face when transitioning from traditional nitrogen-based fertilizers to humate-based solutions?
That's the fun part about this is the humates and humic acids, while they are certified organic products, the interesting part is most of the users are conventional users. They continue to use their conventional practices and they are adding them to supplement and help retain that nutrient and make it last longer. So you're using them similar to how you would a urease inhibitor or other products. You're adding them to your current application without much change.
There was research that showed humates can decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Can you tell me more about that research?
Yeah, so it does vary by soil type and texture. And so I think farmers should look at that research and say, okay, will I get 30%? And that's going to vary by soil type and texture. Qualify that with your soil type and make sure that it's relative to your operation.
And then beyond emission reductions, how do humates enhance soil vitality and structure, looking long term for the agricultural production?
Farmers talk about soil organic matter, and that's where the conversation ends. We got low soil organic matter, and they really don't dive into what the components of soil organic matter are. Soil organic matter has two pools. You have an active pool and a passive pool. And the active pool being those components that are being actively degraded by soil microbes. And you also have the passive pool, which is the leftovers. The organic acids have been degraded by microbes and are stable and are no longer susceptible to degradation. In that pool, you find humic acids, fulvic acids, and humin. And that's the deposits that we mine. So these are ancient plant deposits that are fully degraded. humates are contributing to your passive fraction of your soil organic matter, which does a few things for your soil. Improves soil texture, which impacts water conservation, nutrient retention, and in addition to it just loosening up the soil and aiding roots to penetrate the soil better, getting access to more air, oxygen, and water.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Lorrie Boyer.
I am visiting with Carl McDermott. He is the Chief Service Officer for California-based Delta Trak. We'll be talking about Delta Trak and what they do here shortly. But Carl, to get us started, tell me about yourself and your background.
You might have guessed I'm a Brit. I've been living actually in Mexico for 30 plus years. So left the UK in my kind of mid-20s looking for a sense of adventure. Landed up running a business for what's now called Accenture in Mexico. And liked it so much I've stayed. So I guess my optic is very much North American. I've spent pretty much all my life in technology. So, started doing enterprise solutions, spent 10 years doing strategy and innovation projects, and the last 15 or so have been logistics or supply chain. So I was EVP for a last mile logistics company with 5,000 employees, then run a TMS solution, a transport management solution in the cloud, for a couple of years. Went to a Canadian freight tech company based out of Toronto for 6 years, and recently joined Delta Trak. That was back in April of this year. So I've been in the company like 8 months or so.
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful. What is Delta Trak? Tell me more about this company.
Yeah, Delta Trak's a pioneer of what we call cold chain logistics. Our founder and CEO, Fred Wu, started out this business basically doing temperature recorders, right? The simple devices that help producer growers understand what's happened in the supply chain from when they packed it into the container or on a truck, all the way through until it arrived to their either the supplier or the receiver. And Fred started that 35 years ago. Obviously, we've seen a lot of innovation since then. We've seen the digital thermometers come on, which are USB, which again makes it easier to capture the data. I would say that the big change in the industry was 6 years ago, Lorrie, when we saw the convergence of real-time data coming off the cell network. So you've got devices that connect over the cell network and provide all this temperature, humidity, shock, light data in real time, so that we can proactively manage the shipment, not just wait to the end of the journey to see what's happened. That was great for the pandemic, because I think the three big questions of the pandemic generally were, where's my produce? When's it going to arrive? And has it arrived in good condition? So the fact that we had these real-time trackers or real-time rockers really helped, some of your customers or your audience really track their produce through the supply chain. My job then is to take all the data we have and then layer in services that make sense for everyone in that supply chain, from the smaller producer growers who maybe want to get insurance. So we work with a great partner called Marsh, the world's largest insurance broker, to give them a way to protect their loads, really simply using a transactional shipment by shipment policy. We also work with a company called Blooms. They do factoring. So again, smaller producer growers want to get their capital, working capital back into the organization quicker. We can do, factoring, which is a great lever for, helping grow businesses. We help with documentation, inspections, QA, all the way through to what I would call the consumer realm, which is QR codes, right? How do we bring consumers into the world of, understanding, all the hard work our producer growers do in terms of creating, great and nutritional products, getting their feedback, proving provenance, farm to fork. I think these are, some of the terms that are important now for, many consumer demographics who are worried about, sourcing, and then, how those producers move through the supply chain. So that's a little bit about, what we do at Delta Trak, and then what specifically the UPQ network is, which is, to enable all these services with data.
Carl, what are some of the commodities that are included in a cold chain?
a great question, Lorrie. So I think we can split it up into maybe two or three, macro commodities. So you've got everything in produce. And produce is one of the biggest challenges for cold chain because at the end of the day, a lot of those producers is actually, they're living elements. They're still ripening if it's avocados. There's still kind of respiration happening from when they were actually picked in the field and packed, cooled, sent through the supply chain all the way through to the receiver, at their distribution centers and then, onto the stores and into the hands of the consumer. So, I think that one of the biggest segments that we work with, and obviously that whole produce supply chain, so it's avocados, it's all the berries, it's, apples, pears, stone fruit, anything around, I would say fresh fruit and vegetables that need some kind of tracking within the supply chain. So that's one area of cold chain. Another one will obviously be protein. So again, anything around the protein. So it could be beef, cattle, chickens, seafood. That's another key area, I think, of cold chain. And the final one would be certain, consumer goods, right? Which again needs to be managed. I mean, the one that always comes to mind is ice cream. And obviously, what people want again is, great produce or great protein or great ice cream when it eventually gets delivered and they buy it and they, consuming it at home. So those would be some of the biggest, I would say, macro categories of the whole cold chain segment, specifically as it relates to agri-food.
I'm talking here today with Carl McDermott, Chief Service Officer for Delta Trak, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back as I continue my conversation here today with Carl McDermott, Chief Services Officer for Delta Trak. Carl, what are some of the current trends that we are experiencing in the produce industry and the cold chain logistics industry?
One of the most talked about trends, at least for the last 2 years, was FSMA 204. And the FSMA 204 regulations were basically set up to improve food safety in the United States. It's a fairly robust set of legislation which basically allows us to create what's called a sortable spreadsheet in 24 hours to identify sources of foodborne illness. So basically having this sortable spreadsheet means that, the authorities can help direct a recall and maybe not create and direct the recall to the actual source of the problem without creating food waste in any kind of adjacent categories or adjacent farms that weren't affected. So that's a key piece of legislation that I think is helping provide a more robust, a more secure, if you like, supply chain, but really focuses on food safety as much as anything else. There are others, obviously, which are critical. You've just had some elections in the United States. So California has some very robust legislation around carbon emissions. Okay, again, that's maybe impacting large organizations as it is today. But a lot of your audience, your producer growers are going to have to start to create some kind of simple carbon accounting if they're working with large Californian companies or organizations who do business in California, just to provide the carbon emissions for, the farming and then the supply chain. Because you've had elections, I'm not sure how the national federal level is going to play out. And that's probably one of the discussion points that we can have today, Lorrie, is, what, given that there's, that you have a new president elect, what does that mean for the produce sector? But I would say FSMA 204, that's the biggest piece of legislation in produce specifically. It affects seafood as well. But also the carbon emissions in general is, something that it's a reporting requirement in California. There is some good anecdotal evidence and good science-based evidence that, it is creating fires in California. It does displace, producer grows from a specific region and it's moving them elsewhere where they, may be less susceptible to, drought or other climate-based risks.
As we head into the new year, what are some trends that you would expect to see?
That's a great question. So if you remember, I've been living in Mexico for 30 plus years. So Super Bowl is coming up. I think it's, if I'm correct, I'm just going to have to look at this, 9th of February. So literally there's 20 days between the incoming president being sworn in and the Super Bowl. You've heard about, and I think it's really posturing in other areas, but you've heard about some of the geopolitics around the tariffs that were going to be enforced, right? So again, I think this was done in very good meaning. It's basically trying to address some of those imbalances in trade, specifically, from countries that have maybe not done or not done played by the rule book, right, if you like. So it's more maybe orientated towards China. But across the board tariffs will also kind of drive up the cost of food. Remember, the US imports a lot of the produce. It's coming obviously from Salinas Valley, from Florida, from other parts of the US, but a lot of it's coming from countries like Mexico. So one of the first things will happen if there's tariffs across the board is you'll see, again, probably an uptick in prices. I'm not saying it's going to put the Super Bowl guacamole at risk, at least not for next year, but you'll see it in that those prices start to drift upwards if there is a 10% tariff. So that's something that we should be wary of, because it really goes about, food security and the food supply chain, which in North America is very well integrated. Now, the flip side of that is the US exports a lot of grains and a lot of protein products to Mexico. So if there's some retaliatory measures, obviously then, the companies that are at risk there are the producers for those particular protein categories. So again, I think we need to be very careful not to overstep the mark, direct the tariffs, for the right purposes, without basically, bringing additional costs into the supply chain that's going to be felt by consumers, in their daily or weekly basket.
Anything else to add here today?
Another, I would say, plank of the US elections was immigration. And again, I think there's some very good reasons to have, security of your border. If you remember, Brexit, was the UK leaving the European Union. A lot of that was basically fought around, the problem of immigration. Now, again, in the agricultural world, there is what's called the agricultural visa, right? I think it's called, I'm just looking at the data here, H2A, temporary visa for agricultural workers. Now, if we need to find the right balance of, do we have enough workers to basically pick the produce in the US farms? And I go back to Salinas Valley, the languages you'll hear there are mostly, not exclusively, but Spanish speakers, because that's who's doing a lot of the picking. So again, the immigration side and the deportations, that we have to be very careful there to make sure that there's enough workers in the US farms in order to do the picking. And that was one of the big issues in the UK. The European workers that were actually doing the work of picking all went home, and the UK had to kind of find out new or alternative sources of labor. Obviously, mechanization, and you probably heard about automation, might help that. But still, picking those, avocados to make them, the best quality avocados, and those berries, there is a little bit of manual work there. So I think, immigrations and the visa situation's one. And the final one I just wanted to round off today is around where I think maybe the business world is heading. I think, again, what we're hearing is, there's going to be a strong focus on building national champions. Okay, again, there's some positive parts to that. However, what it might do is create concentration in the retail sector. So again, there's a merger plan for, Kroger and Albertsons. If that goes through, you'll see, more concentration of buyer power. This has already happened in Canada, for example. And buyer power, again, tends to push prices down, which means that the producer growers, those small companies, are going to feel the pain. They might not be able to kind of, adapt to the new pricing structures that, some of these larger organizations are going to put on them.
Once again, my guest today, Carl McDermott, Chief Service Officer with Delta Trak.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. So what kind of challenges could farmers face when transitioning from traditional nitrogen-based fertilizers to humate-based solutions?
That's the fun part about this, is the humates and humic acids, while they are certified organic products, the interesting part is most of the users are conventional users. They continue to use their conventional practices, and they are adding them to supplement and help retain that nutrient and make it last longer. So you're using them similar to how you would a urease inhibitor or other products. You're adding them to your current application without much change.
There was research that showed humates can decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Can you tell me more about that research?
Yeah, so it does vary by soil type and texture. And so I think farmers should look at that research and say, okay, will I get 30%? And that's going to vary by soil type and texture. Qualify that with your soil type and make sure that it's relative to your operation.
And then beyond emission reductions, how do humates enhance soil vitality and structure, looking long term for the agricultural production?
Farmers talk about soil organic matter, and that's where the conversation ends. We got low soil organic matter, and they really don't dive into what components of soil organic matter are. Soil organic matter has two pools. You have an active pool and a passive pool, and the active pool being those components that are being actively degraded by soil microbes. And you also have the passive pool, which is the leftovers, those the organic acids that have been degraded by microbes and are stable and are no longer susceptible to degradation. In that pool, you find humic acids, fulvic acids, and humin. And that's the deposits that we mine. So these are ancient plant deposits that are fully degraded. Humates are contributing to your passive fraction of your soil organic matter, which does a few things for your soil. Improves soil texture, which impacts water conservation, nutrient retention, and in addition to it just loosening up the soil and aiding roots to penetrate the soil better, getting access to more air, oxygen, and water.
To get to know more about Live Earth products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halvorson.
Joining us now is Gino DeCaro. He is the Director of Communications for Wine Institute. We have a couple of things we're talking about today, but we're going to start off talking about some fun items for the wine industry. All right, Gino, we're talking about two things that I hold very close to my heart, wine and the holidays. And I was wondering, let's talk about some wine pairings for the holidays. What do you have up your sleeve?
Well, I got to say, the holiday season in California wine country is simply spectacular, Sabrina. If for your listeners who haven't experienced it, we encourage them to participate and enjoy all that the California wine community has to offer in the holidays. It's certainly always a great and wonderful time for us at Wine Institute and California Wines to highlight the festive lights, the cozy tastings, incredible and unique experiences in wine country itself, and certainly the inspirational holiday recipes paired with California wines, which your listeners can find all of these events, experiences, and our convenient California wine pairing ebook with recipes at discovercaliforniawines.com.
Well, that makes it really easy, doesn't it?
It does.
I like that. So if you were to head out to visit some California wineries during this time of year, what would you be looking to do?
Yeah, so this year we're trying to highlight both the holiday experiences that folks can kind of discover and participate in at one of 154 of California's American viticulture areas. But we're also trying to underscore these events that people can actually gift to friends and family. It's nice because you can give these very unique gifts and without risk of being regifted. It's just a great way to kind of promote something that you love, whether it's a wine or an experience at one of these wineries. And some of the ones I wanted to highlight today with you were, there's Six Sigma Ranch in Lake County where folks can participate and ride the vineyards in an ATV and visit the winery's highest elevation vineyard. That's kind of one of my favorites that I'm going to try to participate in. Prisoner Wine Company in Napa Valley, for instance, has an event where they're pairing their wines with dim sum, which is kind of an interesting event and something that is maybe perhaps a little bit more out of the ordinary, but worth your listeners' time. There's also Ancient Peaks Winery in San Luis Obispo, and they are highlighting, promoting an e-bike and a hike and zip lining and a ride among their vines. What a great experience to take an electric bicycle tour through its sprawling Santa Margarita Ranch and Vineyard. And the zip lining, how can you go wrong? And I think my personal favorite is down in Temecula in Southern California at a winery called Botella, where they're introducing their attendees to blend their own wine and take home a bottle or two of their own personally blended wine. And it's a really unique experience and great way to understand how some of these more than 100 varietals blend into particular wines in California. And these are just some of the things they can do. Again, we encourage your listeners to go to discovercaliforniawines.com, where they can see all of the events that were posted, whether they're in December during the holidays or some of the unique experiences that come in the new year, perhaps something that your listeners can give to their viewers. And again, at that website, they can also pick up the California wine pairing and recipe ebook that we put together over the last few months. And there's really some pretty spectacular meals and wine pairings in there.
So do you have a favorite wine pairing for the holiday?
Well, I got to tell you, some of it is new to me, and my wife and I were talking about trying the deviled eggs trio, which pair quite nicely with a California rosé and a California sparkling wine. And you can it's nice because there are options in the recipe. You can do them with smoked trout, with harissa, which is probably my favorite, and also with caviar. I think my wife and I are going to start with the harissa one and bring that to our first holiday gathering this year. And a lot of these, I will say, are very simple recipes. We tried to keep this really easy for the folks who were downloading the ebook and wanted to pair the wines with their meals. None of these are going to take more than 30 to 40 minutes, unless it's the turkey one, and really simple to make, and really just pairs so perfectly with some of those distinct California wines that we all love so much.
You know, there's just something magical about a recipe that sounds so decadent, but yet is really simple to create. And then to have the wine pairing already, the information already there for you, I personally, I'm a big fan.
Absolutely. And in this day and age, Sabrina, as we all know, we don't have a lot of time. The wine makes the meal. It really elevates the meal. So the more simple we can make the recipe, the better it is, and the more apt people are to take advantage of it. So we're really hoping a lot of folks use this holiday season and beyond.
So one more time for that web address.
DiscoverCaliforniaWines.com.
And while I have you, the report did just come out about this year's California vintage as far as how our wines are looking for this year. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Sabrina, it looks like this year is really set to be a banner vintage for California wines. The old cliche, less is more. You can use that for this year because the quantities look to be a little lower than last year, but the quality is apparently spectacular. Some quotes we've received from some winemakers for our recent report that we just put out. From a winemaker out of Napa Valley, I am seeing beautiful, deeply colored Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, backed with concentrated fruit, pillowy tannins, and bright acidity. From a winemaker in Paso Robles, so far this vintage looks to be fantastic, showing great color, structure, and mature flavors. This has been a vintage worth the wait. So that looks like up and down the state, this harvest is just going to be this vintage, is going to be spectacular. It looks like the growing season started cool and wet and rainy, and the late summer heat really let those grapes ripen perfectly. And for all intents and purposes, this vintage looks like it's going to be one your listeners and the rest of us are going to want to get our hands on after these things get in the barrel and into bottles.
All right. Well, as always, I always appreciate chatting with you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome, and thank you as well.
That's our show for today. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. On behalf of Lorrie Boyer and myself, thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.